The winter after liberation came early and hard. Snow covered the scars of Port Varen, softening the ruins of the harbor and the blackened stones where fire had torn through the docks. German signs were pulled down and burned. Checkpoints vanished. For the first time in years, people walked the streets without papers in their pockets or fear in their throats. Freedom did not arrive loudly. It crept in, uncertain and fragile. Marta survived the war by refusing to let herself collapse. In the days after the Germans fled, she helped organize food distribution, shelter for the displaced, and care for the wounded left behind. She slept little. When she did, she dreamed of gunshots echoing in the square and woke with her heart racing. Erik's grave became a quiet gathering place. Not official. Not announced. People came alone or in pairs, leaving flowers, scraps of cloth, even tools from the docks. No one spoke much there. Words felt inadequate. When Allied officials finally arrived weeks later, they brought paperwork, assessments, and questions. Why had the harbor been destroyed so thoroughly? Who had coordinated the sabotage? Marta answered carefully. Navrik had resisted. Navrik had suffered. Individual names were not offered. The officials accepted it. There were larger wars still burning. Navrik was no longer strategically useful, and that, finally, worked in its favor. As spring returned, rebuilding began. The harbor was not restored to its former size. That was a deliberate choice. Fishing returned first, then trade, small and controlled. The mines remained sealed, declared unsafe and unnecessary. No one argued very hard. Anton Rivik returned from the mountains with a limp and fewer men than he had left with. He took charge of local security until proper governance could be restored, then quietly stepped aside. He had fought enough wars for one lifetime. Marta was asked to run for office when Navrik formed its first independent council. She refused at first, then ACC. The square was full long before sunset. German trucks lined the streets, engines idling. Soldiers stood in rigid lines, rifles polished, faces empty. Civilians were forced into the open, packed together under watchful eyes. Fear hung heavier than the smoke drifting from the harbor ruins. Erik Halden walked into the square on unsteady legs, his arm bound tightly beneath his coat. Each step sent pain through his body, but he kept moving. Two resistance fighters flanked him at a distance, not to protect him, but to make sure he reached the center. Marta watched from the edge of the crowd, her hands clenched so hard her nails drew blood. She understood what Erik was doing the moment she saw him. A German officer stepped forward, his voice amplified by loudspeakers. He began reading names. One by one, prisoners were dragged onto the platform. Some cried. Some stared ahead in silence. When the fifth name was called, Erik stepped forward. "I am responsible," he shouted, his voice cracking but carrying. "The harbor. The convoy. It was me." A ripple moved through the crowd. The officer stopped reading. "I planned it," Erik continued. "I placed the charges. These people had nothing to do with it." The officer studied him, eyes narrowing. "You expect mercy?" "No," Erik said. "I expect you to keep your word." The officer hesitated only a moment. Order mattered more than justice. He signaled to his men. Erik was seized and dragged onto the platform. Marta bit down on a scream. The execution was swift. No speech. No ceremony. A single shot echoed across the square. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. Then something unexpected happened. German radios crackled to life all at once. Officers began shouting questions. Confusion spread through the ranks like fire through dry grass. From the harbor came the sound of aircraft. Allied planes tore through the sky, low and fast. Bombs fell on the remaining military installations, precise and devastating. The German destroyer, still Stroh. The name Navrik did not appear on any official map of Europe in 1939. It was a narrow stretch of land pressed between mountains and sea, claimed and forgotten by larger powers for generations. Its villages were small, its roads crude, its people stubborn and quiet. That anonymity ended the moment war began to spread like a sickness across the continent. When Germany marched east and west in the same breath, Navrik was supposed to be ignored. It had no oil fields, no great factories, no famous ports. What it did have was position. Rail lines passed through its valleys. A deep-water harbor sat hidden behind rocky cliffs. And beneath its soil lay something no one talked about openly, but everyone important knew existed. Erik Halden learned this the day the train stopped carrying passengers and started carrying soldiers. He was a dock worker, 27 years old, broad-shouldered, with hands permanently scarred by rope burns and cold steel. He had lived his entire life in Port Varen, loading cargo that arrived nameless and left the same way. When the first German ships appeared on the horizon, no one panicked. Foreign vessels were common. War rumors were not. The panic came when the flags were raised. By nightfall, boots echoed through the streets. Orders were shouted in a language most locals did not speak. Radios were confiscated. The harbor was sealed. Navrik, neutral by declaration and powerless by reality, had been occupied without a single shot fired. Erik stood in the crowd as an officer read the proclamation. Cooperation would be rewarded. Resistance would be crushed. For most people, survival meant keeping their heads down. For Erik, something inside him hardened. His father had died in the last war, fighting under another country's banner for reasons no one remembered. Erik had promised himself he would never die for someone else's ambition. He did not yet know how badly that promise would be tested. Within weeks, the occupation tightened. Curfews were info. The armored division did not come to intimidate. It came to finish the job. By early summer of 1944, Navrik lived under the constant grind of engines and boots. Tanks were parked near schools. Artillery was positioned in fields that had once grown barley. The harbor was sealed tighter than ever, with naval patrols sweeping the waters day and night. The occupiers no longer pretended this was temporary. They were digging in. Erik Halden watched all of it from the same docks where he had once hauled crates and cursed the cold. Now those docks were stacked with ammunition and guarded by men barely older than the boy who had been executed 2 years earlier. The resistance had thinned. Some were dead. Some were captured. Some had fled into the mountains and never returned. Those who remained were harder, quieter, and fully aware that mistakes were no longer survivable. Marta walked with a limp now. The cellar had left its mark on her body, but not on her resolve. She had taken over coordination in the city, moving between safe houses with a calm that unsettled even seasoned fighters. The mine's expansion begins in 10 days, she told Erik one night, spreading stolen documents across a kitchen table lit by a single candle. They're bringing in forced laborers from occupied regions. Once that starts, the harbor becomes untouchable. Erik studied the papers. Timetables. Guard rotations. Cargo manifests marked with codes he recognized now. We don't have the numbers to stop that, he said. No, Marta agreed. But we might have the timing. James Walker had gone silent weeks earlier. The radio still worked, but London no longer responded. Either they were compromised, or the larger war had swallowed Navrik whole. That uncertainty gnawed at Erik. They had been promised support, airdrops, coordination. Instead, they were alone, facing an armored division with rifles, homemade explosives, and a harbor full of fuel. Then the mountains answered. It started with a single ambush on